1 million electric vehicles in Europe are about to hit the road, thanks to batteries produced right next door to the US. Meanwhile, the US stands on the sidelines, watching as these batteries make their way across the Atlantic. So why has a $20 billion plan in Ontario closed its doors to the very market that once helped it thrive? And who will pay the price? This becomes even more striking when we look back at recent history, before Ontario decided to cut back its energy exports, including batteries to the US. The two sides had $8 billion, representing 45.5% of Canada's total FDI, according to statistics. Canada, however, the shift underway, particularly in the bond market, reflects a desire for diversification and increased financial autonomy. Canada issues more than $200 billion in USD-denominated bonds each year, and the change in underwriting entities is gradually reshaping the balance of power. In the short term, this is an adjustment, but in the long term, if US protectionist policies continue or become more permanent, the trend toward financial decentralization will be irreversible. International investors, from pension funds to large financial institutions, will begin adjusting their strategies, opting for risk diversification instead of relying on a single financial market. Is also a subtle message to US financial institutions. If you want to keep your role in Canada, you need to ensure consistency and neutrality in your partnerships. Despite the tensions, the financial relationship between Canada and the US remains deep. By the end of 2024, Canada's direct investment in the US stood at $1,289 trillion, accounting for 52% of Canada's total foreign investment. Conversely, direct investment from the US into Canada reached $683 trillion. Strategic preparation as the global supply chain and financial structures are reshaped. Canada can no longer afford to maintain a one-sided dependency model. Expanding financial networks to Europe and Asia not only provides greater stability, but also reduces risks from unilateral policies. I believe that if this change continues over the next 3-5 years, it will create a new financial ecosystem in Canada, one where international banks can only remain central if they meet two conditions: stability and political neutrality. Whereas Wall Street used to be the go-to hub for provincial financial deals, now cities like London, Frankfurt, and even Tokyo are emerging as viable alternatives from a business perspective. Having more financing channels with fewer political ties means more stability in securing capital, especially during geopolitical risk periods. This is especially critical for businesses in clean energy, high-tech, and cross-border manufacturing industries. In my view, Canadian provinces excluding US banks is not a knee-jerk reaction, but if this trend continues, it could cost them hundreds of millions over the next few years. Instead, European banks like Barclays, BNP Paribas, and Deutsche Bank, as well as Canadian institutions like RBC Capital Markets and TD Securities, are stepping in to fill the gap. These banks are not only increasing their market share, but also receiving long-term trust signals from Canadian provincial governments. In my opinion, the key issue isn't just how much money the US banks are losing, but the broader trend of financial decentralization. Morgan have played a critical role in underwriting bonds for Canadian provinces and corporations. Their market share not only ensures liquidity for the bond market, but also brings in tens of millions in underwriting fees annually. However, with Ontario and Alberta both excluding these institutions from multi-billion-dollar deals in 2025, the position of US banks is under serious threat, according to data from Bloomberg. And industry sources, just the Ontario bond deal in June saw US banks lose about $10 million in underwriting fees. From a dependency model to a more balanced, proactive approach in trade strategy, it's worth noting that Canada's economy is heavily reliant on exports, with the US accounting for 75% of the country's export value from 2019 to 2023. Therefore, any shifts in US policy have wide-reaching implications. Provinces like Ontario and Alberta's proactive restructuring of their trade partnerships is a noteworthy effort to avoid being locked into a vulnerable economic model for years. Major U.S. banks, especially Bank of America, Krupp, and JP, enacted a procurement policy that mandates provincial ministries, agencies, and hospitals to only use domestic suppliers unless no domestic option exists. Politico labelled this as one of the toughest actions by a provincial government in Canada since the NAFTA era. At the national level, provinces like British Columbia have proactively sought trade partners in Europe and East Asia through trade promotion programs and tariff incentives. While not entirely severing ties with the US, in my view, this signals that Canada is shifting from provincial financial deals is not an isolated phenomenon. It's part of a broader response to escalating trade tensions. Since the beginning of 2025, the US government has reintroduced tariffs targeting Canadian exports, including aluminum, steel, and various industrial components. This mirrors the damaging impact of the 2018 tariffs. In March 2025, Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced that the province would cease contracting US-based companies as long as the tariffs remain in place. Not only was this a statement, but the government also signals a clear trend. Provincial governments in Canada are restructuring financial relationships with a focus on mitigating risks from an increasingly unstable partnership. Alberta is not alone. British Columbia, though not excluding US banks from deals, has introduced policies encouraging public agencies to source from Canadian or non-US countries. These actions could be seen as part of an interprovincial financial network, a shift that was once rare in Canada's economy, which has been deeply reliant on US markets. The exclusion of US banks, bond without any US bank participation, marking the first time in 6 years, according to Bloomberg. Bank of America, once a key player in Alberta's deals, was excluded from the underwriting list. This deal came just weeks after the US government reimposed tariffs on aluminum and steel imports from Canada. In this context, Alberta's decision can be seen as a policy response, even if not publicly stated. Moreover, AMCO, the province's largest pension fund, also scaled back its business trips and trade contacts with the US. In my opinion, this Canada's domestic financial system against external volatility economically. It's also an opportunity for Canadian and European banks to expand their influence in Canada's $200 billion plus bond market. Industry data suggests that this single deal alone cost us banks approximately $10 million in underwriting fees. It's not just Ontario. Changes in how financial deals are approached are spreading to other Canadian provinces. Alberta is a prime example. In mid-March 2025, the province issued a €1.25 billion denominated without US financial institutions involved, according to Wealth Professional Canada. This decision comes amid increasing trade tensions between the two countries, especially since US tariffs were reinstated in 2025 for years. Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, and Citibank played pivotal roles in Canada's provincial bond deals. However, this shift sends a clear message. Ontario is proactively diversifying its financial partners, reducing reliance on US banks. In my opinion, this move is a calculated response to safeguard a single US bank was involved. If this trend continues, it might not just affect Wall Street, it could hit your retirement fund or paycheck. Is this the first step toward financial independence from Wall Street? In June 2025, the Ontario Finance Agency made an unprecedented move, issuing a $2 billion bond without any participation from US banks. Instead, the deal was underwritten by Barclays plc of the UK and 3 Canadian banks: Capital Markets, CIBC, and Bank of Nova Scotia. This is the first time since July 2011 that Ontario issued US dollar bonds. Longer be a partner, though, according to analysis from Utility Dev and ISO. If Ontario completely cuts off the electricity states like Vermont and New York, will not have enough capacity in winter, forcing them to rely on oil and coal-fired power plants, driving costs and emissions through the roof. If a single tariff policy can cause Ontario to completely pull out of the US supply chain, what will happen if Washington continues using protectionist policies? As its default tool, Canada just issued a $2 billion bond deal, and guess what? Not. Ontario is becoming the European integration hub right in North America. If this trend continues, and there are no signs of it stopping, Ontario could become the strategic battery hub of Europe in the Western Hemisphere. Not the US, not Mexico, in my view. The danger lies not in the US losing a source of supply, but in the fact that Washington no longer has control over the value chains right next to it. The Northeast US power grid, once designed with a shared bidirectional logic, now faces a reality. The other side of the line might know. In manufacturing, where electricity is a key input, the entire production chain from electric vehicles to steel and chemicals saw costs rise from a quiet supplier. Ontario is now positioning itself as a strategic bottleneck, where any disruption creates cascading effects. At the same time, according to FAO, on reports battery component suppliers in Ontario, previously exporting to factories in Kentucky and Tennessee, are now shifting orders to Hamburg, Lyon and Rotterdam. The EV supply chain, once linked to the US market, is now branching out, and just weeks after the tariff increase, Ontario immediately imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the US, mostly from hydroelectric power. But more importantly, the logic behind this response, Ontario didn't respond to a policy. They responded to a behavior and restructured the entire trade model to no longer be dependent on Washington's political actions. When hit with a 25% surcharge, electricity costs jumped 17% within 2 weeks. Vermont and Michigan were similarly affected, but the impact didn't stop at electricity prices. Aluminum from Canada by 50%, according to Market Watch. This wasn't the first time the US had imposed tariffs on Canada, but it was the first time Ontario saw it as a blow to the alliance structure. Not just a trade dispute, from my analysis, tariffs are no longer market regulating tools. They've become a political punishment. And when tariffs were applied to steel, Ontario understood that batteries, electricity and raw materials would be next. That's why they didn't respond with words. They responded with a replacement system. Reuters noted that, behind this response, Ontario didn't wait for Washington to back down. It proactively reclaimed control. Each kilowatt of electricity is now not just energy, but a bargaining chip from a strategic viewpoint. Ontario didn't respond to a policy, they responded to behavior and restructured the entire trade model to no longer be dependent on Washington's political decisions. Everything started from what seemed like a standard protectionist policy. In March 2025, the Trump administration announced it was raising tariffs on steel and Market Watch. When the US doubled tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada to 50%, they didn't just increase costs, they triggered a process of trust erosion. Ontario was forced to reassess and realized that the old model was unbalanced. Canada supplied materials, the US set prices, and control always tilted in one direction. Then, as Reuters reported on March 10, 2025, Ontario responded by imposing a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the US, primarily from hydroelectric power, but more importantly, the logic. In a new manufacturing network operating according to European standards using domestic energy and not depending on the US, this serves as an economic buffer zone to protect against political risks. In my forecast, holding back nearly 10% of electricity production forces Ontario to activate backup sources, raising system costs by about 15% in the first quarter. People in Ontario may see their electricity bills rise by an average of 9% before they begin to decline. If renewable energy expansion succeeds by 2027 on the US side, the shock is more immediate and pronounced. New York currently depends on about 13% of its electricity imported from Ontario. According to ISO-NE reports, the 25% import tariff on electricity means costs will rise by more than $120 moles for decades. Ontario was the natural extension of America's industrial belt. In the 1980s, factories in Detroit, Buffalo, and Ontario cycled parts, steel, and energy as if there were no borders. Many US companies trusted Ontario as a reliable logistics hub, but I believe Washington's tariff policies have severed that soft link, according to imposes arbitrary tariffs and interferes in supply chains with executive orders. Ontario is forced to build a self-contained model outside US influence where every dollar of investment is not at risk due to political uncertainty. According to Utility Dive, Ontario's decision to halt electricity exports in 2025 is not a temporary reaction, but a systemic warning, forcing the US to reconsider its dependency on cross-border electricity supplies. From a strategic standpoint, the Volkswagen plant is not just an industrial project, it is the first link. Political climate of Washington on the surface. Many media outlets view this as a trade shift for diversification, but in my opinion, this is a form of covert geopolitical optimization. Ontario is not just seeking new consumers, it is redesigning its entire dependency architecture, shifting from a Washington-centered pivot to one towards Brussels and Berlin. This isn't happening because Canada is against the US, but because trust in Washington has disappeared from the investment equation when the US behaves unpredictably. Factories cut costs and reduce reliance on China in April 2023. According to Reuters, Ontario signed a $20 billion deal with Volkswagen to build North America's largest battery plant in St. Thomas. The plant, set to open in 2027, will supply batteries for 1 million electric vehicles per year in Europe, creating over 3,000 direct jobs in my analysis. Excluding the US from the supply chain is a strategic move, prioritizing stable markets, high profit margins, and clear policies from the EU rather than relying on the risky, like General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis all have factories here. Ontario doesn't just assemble, but also manufactures and supplies batteries with strategic partnerships with companies like Volkswagen, LG Chem, and Tesla. The batteries produced in Ontario were once the lifeblood of the US EV industry. The benefits were once mutual. Ontario attracted over $35 billion in investments, creating tens of thousands of jobs in the battery and clean energy sectors. The US benefited from cheap batteries and electricity, helping EV. Along with $700 million from EV batteries and components, the US benefited from this low-cost supply, helping each EV factory save up to $30 million annually. In my view, this two-way relationship only works when there is trust, when Washington imposed tariffs and Ontario lost control of the supply chain. The province responded decisively, retain its resources, realign its markets, and rewrite the rules. No longer prioritizing the US as it had before in the electric vehicle industry, Ontario's role is even more pronounced. Companies maintained a strong, stable trade relationship for decades, especially in the energy and automotive sectors. Canada, and specifically Ontario, has been a key partner in supplying clean energy to the US from hydro, wind, and solar, with states like New York, Michigan, and Vermont heavily relying on cross-border supply before Ontario reduced exports. Canada and the US had maintained a stable relationship in energy and industrial sectors. Ontario supplied up to 15% of New York's electricity, bringing in about $1.50 billion annually.